Welcome, everyone. We'll get started. Welcome to this symposium titled Transporting Images. First of all, I want to thank the Kogut Institute for the Humanities at Brown for their support for hosting this event. I am also very grateful to Fouad Torshizi, who teaches art of the Islamic world at RISD, and who recently co-edited a special issue of the journal Art Margins, dedicated to art history, post-colonialism, and the global turn. Fouad has very kindly accepted our invitation to moderate the second panel of the symposium. I will moderate the first one. My name is Peter Szendy. I'm Professor of Comparative Literature and Humanities here at Brown. And of course, and above all, I want to thank warmly our speakers for traveling here, some from nearby, Jennifer Roberts from Harvard, Shannon Mattern from UPenn, some from far away, Georges Didi-Huberman, who came from Paris, from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where he teaches, to stay here in the French and Francophone Studies department, where he's Sorel writer in residence for 10 days. The format of our event is very simple. The speakers, each of us, because I will speak too, have at their disposal more or less 50 minutes, to unfold their arguments. We can gather a few questions at the end of the first panel, which will gather Georges Didi-Huberman and Jennifer Roberts, before we take a short break. And then we will do the same after the second panel, moderated by Fouad, with myself and Shannon Mattern as speakers. And after that, there will be a reception where you will be able to meet our speakers and continue the discussion more informally. I am all the more pleased and moved, actually, that our three speakers are gathered here today, since the very idea for this symposium emerged literally from the intersection of their work. I started to think about the migrations of images through the groundbreaking writings of Georges Didi-Huberman, who revived and reinvented the legacy of German art historian Aby Warburg. For me, Georges' reading of Warburg also entered into a sort of silent dialogue with Jennifer Roberts' wonderful book, Transporting Visions, focusing mainly on American paintings of the 18th and 19th century. She wonders, I quote, if traveling pictures are in some sense fabricated out of the spatial distances they cross, end of quote. This idea that pictures might be woven with the traces of their transportation fascinates me, and I will try to say something about it myself. Indeed, it is an idea that seems more urgently relevant than ever today, with an unprecedented number of images in circulation. One partial figure should give you an idea. In 2019, YouTube boasted on its official blog that there were more than 500 hours of video uploaded every minute, which means 720,000 hours a day, the equivalent of more than 80 years. So it's a lifetime of images every day. And since pictures are shared and circulate through undersea cables, screens, electromagnetic waves, but also through shipping containers, cardboard boxes, or envelopes and postcards, it seemed absolutely impossible to think about image traffic without listening to what infrastructure studies have to say. And Shannon Mattern's work on interconnections and logistics is crucial and decisive in this burgeoning field. So let me say very quickly a few words about the image that we chose for the poster announcing our symposium. It is a work by American artist Martha Rosler, a pioneer of feminist video art with Semiotics of the Kitchen in 1974, and author of a famous series of photomontages, House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home, that is to say, the Vietnam War in the late 60s. Closer to the topic of our symposium, there is a series of photographs titled Rites of Passage. Our poster, and you can see it here in an enlarged version for a retrospective of the artist's work at the Jewish Museum in New York in 2018. Our poster is a photo montage from the series Body Beautiful or Beauty Knows No Pain, 1965-72. It is titled Cargo Cult, an allusion to a highly problematic anthropological category that was widely used from 1945 onward before being critically questioned in more recent scholarship. The phrase cargo cult was born in a colonial context and had openly condescending overtones. The Oxford English Dictionary, in its example of usage, quotes an article from the Sydney Morning Herald in 1949. I quote, "The fantastic cargo cult among New Guinea natives has become a serious problem for Australian administrators. Natives influenced by it believe that the spirits of their ancestors will arrive shortly in ships and airplanes carrying cargoes of food, tobacco, axes, and other goods," end of quote. By ironically using this phrase that is so fraught with violence, both symbolic and real, Martha Rosler returns it to the sender, so to speak. Those who believe in the magic of commodities are not the so-called natives of colonialist or anthropological discourse, but the subjects subjected to global capitalistic cosmetics. Her photo montage also suggests that these cosmetic images, this manufacturing of the idealized Western face, looking at itself in the mirror, is made possible by a manual labor, by a hidden logistics. The white faces are loaded and shipped by a black labor power, with maybe the only exception being the foreman, who appears to be white. Indeed, the global traffic of images today, the handling and delivery of the pictorial commodities that circulate on the global market of visibility, is the result of the exploitation of what we could characterize as underpaid eyes. French artist Lorraine Huret has dedicated a series of works to the hundreds of thousands of people subcontracted by companies like Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, mainly in India and the Philippines, to sort and delete undesirable content. We often think that our images are filtered by algorithms, but it is largely done by human content moderators who analyze tens of thousands of traumatizing images every day. They clean the internet of torrents of pictorial dirt. In 2019, Lorraine Huret made a beautiful video portrait of one of these workers, whom she met when she went to Manila. It is titled in French, Portrait en Sainte Lucie, Leslie Ann Cow, which is the name of the worker. I wonder what Aby Warburg, the great German art historian, who was the first to systematically think about the migration of images, would have thought about this modern-day Saint Lucy with her prosthetic eyes. And I wonder also, Georges might be able to tell us, if Warburg has ever written about Santa Lucia. I won't even try to present our first speaker's work, which is immense and immensely important. Georges Didi-Huberman is the author of about 60 books, I gave a more worthy introduction, I'm sorry for today, to his oeuvre on Tuesday for the inaugural lecture of his residency here at Brown. Today I will limit myself to mentioning two of his writings translated into English, where the question of migration is unfolded in many ways, the migration of images, of symbols, of gestures, of symptoms. One is The Surviving Image, Phantoms of Time and Time of Phantoms, Aby Warburg's History of Art, published in French in 2002. And the other is Atlas, or The Anxious Gay Science, published in French in 2011. A book that grew out of an exhibition, actually, curated by Georges at the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. The title of Georges' talk today is The History of Art is a Story of Migrations. And Georges wanted to add a very important S to the announcement as it was published on the poster. Please join me in welcoming Georges.
Thank you very much, Peter, as usual. I'm sorry, perhaps my English will be not very good. Images often have the bad reputation of being nothing more than crises of reason. They are extravagant, in fact. It's as if they were already being reproached for not consisting, for not holding in place, and consequently, for only forming lesser realities. Images have no solid ontological foundation. Is this because they never stop migrating, crossing borders? Shouldn't we admit that every image must be thought of a moment in a movement, a stage in a migration? In one of his most famous capriccios, Goya depicted the collapse of his own vigilant reason, or the sort of explosion of his lucid reason. His sleep, with his head between his arms resting on his work table, became a dream sueño, giving rise to a whole people of ghosts or monsters, monstruos, as it from a Pandora's box. A whole host of moving images would emerge from his head, mixing in a great tohu-bohu above his head. And the ghostly self, a self-portrait floating in the air, anthropomorphic strangers, masks, deformed, grimacing faces, animals, the cat, bat, even a horse floating in space. Goya was undoubtedly the greatest of his time to create images capable of explicitly appealing in his summary of the Caprichos, published in 1799 in the Diario de Madrid, to the critique of imagination that Immanuel Kant, for his part, was attempting to conduct on a purely philosophical level. As a painter of enlightenment and an explorer of shadows, as the inventor of extraordinary dialectical images, Goya, better than anyone else, implemented what the German Romantic poets, who were also his contemporaries, called an immanent critique of the works of the imagination. Hegel then reconceptualized this whole movement of immanent criticism, historizing it as a dialectical process, very well known. and Karl Marx took it up again, except, apparently, for everything to do with the imaginary world. From his materialist point of view, didn't images belong above all to the realm of religion, magic, primitive belief, fetishism, hallucination, anesthesia, opium of the people, impotent utopia, or the denial of historical reality? Criticism of images in the name of the dialectical materialism thus led to a severe and global revocation rather than an immanent analysis. Emerging from age-old beliefs, traditions, images appeared to Marx as nothing more than what he called inverted consciousness of the world, chimerical, fantasticia, relation to human essence, he denounced in 1844, Introduction to Hegel's Critique of the Philosophy of Right. It's worth recalling that such a phantasmatic relationship to reality was then considered a land misery, no matter how admirable the images of illusory happiness, illusorisches Glück, found throughout the history of Western art. Virgins, angels, saints, heroes, paradisiacal places promised to the elect, that is to say, to those who had obeyed well for the end of time. All this, from the point of view of the political anthropology elaborated by Marx, was nothing but a waving of what he called imaginary flowers, imaginären Blumen, around the bonds that enslave peoples under the domination of a clergy or employer power. Nietzsche, in his turn, did not hesitate to castigate all types of clerical power, even in its secularized guise. But in his critique of the imagination, he completely reversed Marx's perspective. Images, sensations, emotions, he said, are not lesser thoughts, signs of a sick reason or escapes from reality. In fact, the opposite should be considered, and the productions of our understanding should be seen as, I quote, shadows always obscure, emptier and simpler, end of quote, than the bodily shadows of our sensations, psychic shadows of our emotions or imaginations. Now, what characterized sensations, emotions, imaginations, what gave them such a fundamental status in Nietzsche's eyes in relation to a reason considered, so to speak, as a secondary elaboration, Durcharbeitung, was precisely their nature of potency or force. Forms always information, and not fixations of forms at a standstill on their own power. In other words, movements, not stasis, processes of axio in distance, subtle migrations, then passages across borders, not established places in an irremovably governed territory. Emotions are only pathological and imaginations are only extravagant in the light of a diminished anthropology, be it an idealist or materialist, supported by two prejudices. First, rejection of pathos. Second, fear of passage. One of the things that Goya showed us was that ghosts fantasies, images, literally get out of our heads. Marx refuted their extravagance by asserting that they escape from our true being and history, true history, by inventing a false human essence. Finally, Aby Warburg, after Nietzsche and with Freud, and it's why I show you a drawing by Warburg from the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, which is a dream novel of Renaissance Italy. Warburg gave us to understand how images bring us back to our very being, the contrary, as these foreign diaphanous creatures, these moving simulacra, these auratic beings from far away, but far away from far inside us. In this way, as Warburg famously put it, he was able to see the Western history of images as a ghost story for grown-ups. It's a very famous statement. This formula, this famous formula, is not that of an historian in the positivist sense of the term, but it's a formula from a psychohistorian, psychohistoriker, as Aby Warburg liked to call himself. This already means that a historical anthropology of images, or a science of culture in general, does not find its theoretical object in things that are exactly isolable and situable in time or space. Rather, it confronts relations or functions, as Ernst Cassirer had proposed as early as 1910, a renewed epistemology beyond any metaphysical fixity of substance. The fundamental theoretical object of such a science of culture would even be migration processes rather than functions in the logical or functionalist sense in an ethnological perspective. According to Warburg, images are migratory in many, many ways and dimensions. All I can do here is to give a brief outline of this versatility, a kind of summary, sorry for that I will organize into 5 lapidary or synthetic propositions. First, nothing in history appears decisively or critically that is not prompted by some psychic migration. The fact that Aby Warburg defined himself as a psychohistorian in 1929, the year of his death, was merely the sign of a loyalty to himself, already explicit in the Vorbemerkung, the preliminary remark to his thesis on Botticelli in 1893. Now, this text, as strategic as it was brief, coming in the place of an unfinished project, as usual in Warburg, for what could have constituted a more developed epistemo-critical preface, so to speak, presented a conceptual triad that was already structuring the complexity of the migratory processes at work throughout Western cultural history. This conceptual sketch thus described the compound of 3 types of psychic migration, legitimizing for the young Warburg something like a grand project of psychologische Ästhetik, psychological aesthetics. 3 psychic movements. Then, first, memorial process reminiscence from pagan antiquity to the Renaissance, understood as, not as renaissance, but as Nachleben, afterlife. Second, affective process, expressive process, producing intensification of bodily and psychic movements represented in the form of what Warburg would later call pathos formulas, pathos formeln, answering his initial question of an affect of empathy, Einfühlung, in the process of becoming a force constituting style, stilbildende Macht. Finally, Botticelli's characteristics, process of shifting, displacing emotional intensity from the bodies themselves to the moving accessories, Bewegtes of hair and drapery. This singularity complexified exactly as Freud did at the same time, forging a new notion of dream work and psychic symptom, the common idea of expression of affect through displacement. So, memorial, affective, displaced. Second proposition. There is probably nothing in history that appears decisively or critically that has not developed through a process of cultural migration. Not a single major historical fact that is not at the fold of such a movement. Not a single claimed identity or national centrality as when Vasari sought to establish that the European Renaissance had only one capital, Florence. No single claimed identity that was not an attempt to fossilize or deny such a migratory condition. Warburg has shown, far from any stylistic chauvinism, that the typically Florentine splendor of Botticelli's painting would never have been that it was without the Flemish migration from Flandre to Florence of Hugo van der Goes' Portinaris triptych. Or, in 1912, that the great European style of the Ferrarese frescoes in Palazzo Schifanoia would never have taken shape without the Arabic migration of an astrological culture whose unexpected layers of incomprehensible contribution, this is a quotation from Warburg, only a critical iconology, kritische Ikonologie, would be able to analyze. Third, Warburg understood that all these processes were at once migrations in space and migrations in time. Therefore, structural migrations, one might say, in that the coalescence of event in time and lines of flight in space are inevitably part of wider, deeper phenomena. These are the rhythms of an immanent pulsation of continuities and discontinuities. Survivals in time, Nachleben, only exist because there are migrations in space, Wanderungen. This can be seen as early in plate 1 of the Mnemosyne Image Atlas, where Babylonian divinatory models dating from around 1007th century BC, from a formally coherent, continuous trajectory right up to the liver of Piacenza, an Etruscan object from the 2nd century BC. However, no continuous tradition can be clearly traced, all the more so as these objects completely absent from Western artistic history, Western art museum, for example, will suddenly awake from their long dormancy, so to speak, with the interest shown in them almost 2,000 years later by the artist Joseph Beuys. It is therefore part of the destiny of images and imaginations, just as Freud spoke of the destiny of drives, that they run like clandestine migrants through the underbelly of official traditions to manifest themselves one day, suddenly, in critical moments, corresponding to formal and semantic processes of intensification, of which Mnemosyne offers numerous examples and even provides in the text of its introduction a now famous model. It is a linguistic model, the model of the suppletive character of Indo-Germanic languages, according to the linguist Hermann Hostoff. For Warburg, the fact that the linguistic root had to be changed to intensify. You say bonus, you intensify, melior, other root. You intensify melior, optimus, another root. So, intensification is an uprooting. It's a migration. Even when it came in to invoking a geological rather than linguistic model, Warburg turned to the notion of light fossil, which implies, like a paradoxical discontinuous continuity, the displacement of soils following tectonic movements and folding of layers, a migratory survival, strictly speaking, of certain geological formations, a reminder that history does not cease, literally, to change terrain. Fourth proposition. Insofar as we perceive them as crises, discontinuities in a tradition fantasied as autochthonous or as anachronistic interruptions in the course of historical progress, closed in on itself, images of survival must be understood as critical or symptomatic migrations. So, after structural, symptomal. It's as if art history could sometimes suffer reminiscences by altering its own tradition through recourse to a foreign exogenous or quite simply repressed element. In both cases, the element or event is of a characteristic strangeness of disquiet. It's the uncanniness, the unheimlich effect that Aby Warburg spotted in the nympha motif when she emerges like a ghost of pagan eroticism in the pious scene painted on the walls of Florence churches. And you see here, she's completely painted in grisaille painting, with her light step, that precisely humanist dance theorist rightly qualified with words such ondeggiare, fantasia, aere, and above all, fantasmata. As Edgar Windt and Frédéric Antal suggested in 1937, it sometimes seems as if a Maenad from the ancient Greece has traveled a long way in space, in memory, and even in desire to throw herself extravagantly at the feet of the cross in some church in Renaissance Tuscany. As early as 1931, the same Edgar Vint had remarkably commented on the philosophical and not merely philological lesson of this great project of Warburgian science of culture envisaged as a critical iconology. Fifth proposition of my present sketch. As in a Kantian type of questioning, Warburg, like Cassirer, having wanted to be a man of enlightenment, the consideration of psychic, cultural, structural, and symptomatic migrations will not have been without reflexive effects on the method and the subject of knowledge itself. Warburg allowed himself to be drawn into the almost mad, apparently Borgesian, yet rigorously justified maze of what might be termed epistemic migrations. This was already apparent in Warburg's personal geography, which often took him between Hamburg and Florence, Strasbourg and Rome, Amsterdam and Napoli, not to mention the famous trip to Arizona among the Hopi villages. In a great journey, evoking the virtual winding line, which in Mnemosyne enabled to understand the migration of a singular object from Babylon to Piacenza. We know, moreover, the essentially fluid, even elusive content that Warburg summoned up when he spoke of formal sources or influences. Warburg epistemic migrations must therefore be considered from the angle of a fluid morphodynamics that is perfectly suited to the movement of the air or water, but also the movements of images and ghosts. Hence, once again, the paradigmatic value of Ninfa as an allegorical figure of Warburg's science without name, just as Gradiva provided Freud with an allegory of his psychic method, a ghostly maid, often painted in grisaille, I repeat. Ninfa brings fruit from elsewhere to the bourgeois Christian context of Ghirlandaio's fresco in Florence. And so it is as if Aby Warburg critical iconology thought of itself as an eccentric knowledge. She is iconology. Always migrant, always carrying something else, always guided by the desire to cross all the closed doors, all the opaque partitions, all the frontiers of academic knowledge. But because these doors, partitions, and frontiers always tend to close, Warburg's work should be read as a stubborn movement to cross our episteme in the manner of a dibuk, you know, the soul of a dead person who continues to speak through our own gestures and discourses. All these crosses form passages, crossings, passages, as can be experienced simply by wandering between just the shelves of the Warburg Library, whose singular and sometimes extravagant classification enables us to leap, as it were, from one field to another, from one problem to another, linked to it, but some often unnoticed underground path, a crossroads discovered thanks to the ferryman, le passeur, Aby Warburg. But all these migrations also form constellations, which the starburst of images in the Mnemosyne Atlas gives an immediate expression of. Far from simple face-off between iconology and formalism, or between phenomenology and semiology, for example, the Warburgian anthropology of images unfolds as both eccentric and critical knowledge. A starry knowledge, so to speak. Reading Warburg, in any case, will have made it clear that all criticism is a migration of points of view, and that any well-thought-out migration produces an effect of immanent criticism in the closest territory of unquestioned certainties where it intervenes. Peter, 10 minutes? It's okay? Okay. It's no coincidence that Warburg was occupied throughout the last decade of his work with a project of political iconology that radicalized through its own anxiety about the First World War, the German Civil War, and then the rise of Nazism, which directly threatened his research institute, his family, and even himself. The initial trajectory of what he called in 1912 a critical iconology, Giordano Bruno and Rembrandt on the one hand, Mussolini and the European anti-Semitism on the other. These were the issues that henceforth challenged the art historian to observe what he called a great cultural psychomachy, pitting the astra of free thought against the monstra of evil that man knows how to inflict on his fellow man. Some years after Warburg's death in 1929, I can say that it was already too late. Many were those who, unknown or already famous, I mean Rudolf Arnheim, Max Friedlander, Ernst Gombrich, Horst Jensen, Ernst Kitzinger, Siegfried Kracauer, Richard Krautheimer, Ernst Kries, Ulrich Middeldorf, Otto Pecht, Erwin Panofsky, Nikolaus Pevsner, Fritz Saxel, Edgar Wind, Rudolf Wiedkauer, etc., had to become exiles from a type of knowledge that, under the impetus of Burckhardt or Wölfflin, Alois Riegel or Warburg himself, a type of knowledge had constituted the pilot discipline of the human sciences through its theoretical inventiveness, stemming from the great debates of German philosophy. In 1933, before putting the finishing touches to his great investigation on the migrations of symbols, Rudolf Wiedkauer was first and foremost a forced migrant, the exile of a political situation of terror from which he was seeking to escape. The very innocent, so to speak, activity of dealing with images, philology, art history, philosophy, in order to make a history of the ghost of history, in short, this does nothing to protect us from history itself. We remain struck by the tragic condition of the thinkers of this time, who were as inventive and powerful in their analysis of the critical migration of culture as they were directly confronted with the political danger of a very concrete and painful migration. Of course, notoriously, it was the case with Walter Benjamin, who, after Warburg, and in a sense very close to Warburg, was a great opener of passages, a collector of images, like the Sibyl in Siena Cathedral, and opener of passages, discoverer of constellations. In his epistemic critical preface to the origin of German Baroque drama, Benjamin makes an intense plea for a philosophical history, which, beyond any inward-looking philology, would lead his micrological work, mikrologische Verarbeitung, towards the constitution through a gesture of theoretical imagination of a new montage, a new assemblage or mosaic, giving the idea of the historical destiny under interrogation. In short, a configuration, a constellation, Sternbild. In so doing, Benjamin makes a crucial point. Philosophical history cannot wisely settle on notions of regularities, averages, or universalizing synthesis. Rather, its critical nature leads it to observe extremes. Extremes become necessary, he says. 10 years later, in the fragments of Central Park, Benjamin, deeply haunted by the ideas of expiry and rescue, as in Kafka, to whom he was very close. This is a drawing by Walter Benjamin, would speak of this extreme on a more precisely temporal level. I quote Benjamin, "The question must be investigated to what extent the extremes to be grasped in rescue are those of too early and too late." We know that for Benjamin, there was no rescue at the right moment. There was no passage at the French-Spanish border of Portbou for the migrant he had become in September 1940. The passage closed before this great opener of passages. As Hannah Arendt, his own cousin, who later did much to trace him, wrote, I quote, "Benjamin committed suicide during the night, and his companions were then authorized by the somewhat impressed border guards to enter Spain. The visa embargo was lifted a few weeks later. A year earlier, Benjamin would have crossed without difficulty. A year later, he would have known in Marseille that it was not possible to cross into Spain at that time. It was only on that day that the catastrophe was possible. But," and I conclude, it's okay? "But that day, when catastrophe is sadly likely, that day, today, is every day. For thousands of people around the world, particularly in the Mediterranean, which is no longer just the beloved sea of culture, the place of migrations from Babylonia to Italy, but now also a terrible sea of barbarism. Nicky Gennari, who helped migrants in the Idomeni camp in March 2016, a time where some 13,000 people were trying to cross into Europe from the Syrian war, wrote a kind of poem for the film she then co-directed with Maria Curcuta. The poem was entitled Des spectres hantent l'Europe, specters haunt Europe. But these specters were closer to Benjamin and Derrida than to Marx himself, since they were insistent, I quote Giannari, insistent figures of our forgotten genealogy. End of quote. From this perspective, in short, migrants are our own returnees. They don't just come from elsewhere, they also come from before. As if they were witnesses to our age-old repressions, starting with the long colonial history of which Western politics has no idea what to do with. As we can see, speaking of a history of ghosts for grown-ups is not at all abstract and is in fact highly topical and critical, provided we understand that the history of our bodies and institutions never ceased to be permeated by psychic movements with all their monsters of reason, monstruos. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georges, for this beautiful talk. This migration, I'm tempted to say, migration through so many migrations and forms of migrations, psychic, cultural, epistemic. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, but as I said, we will keep the questions for after the second talk of this panel. And so I want to introduce very briefly Jennifer Roberts, who is the Drew Gilpin Faust Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University, where she teaches art history, print history, and material studies. I already mentioned in my introduction her wonderful book that was so inspiring for this symposium, Transporting Visions, subtitled The Movement of Images in Early America, 2014. But she's also the author of Mirror Travels, Robert Smithson and History, 2004, of Jasper Jones in Press, The Crosshatch Works and the Logic of Print, 2012, of Jasper Jones, A Catalogue Raisonné of the Monotypes, 2017, and she edited a volume dedicated to scale, to the question of scale, for the Terra Foundation in 2016. She wrote essays on artists like Ruth Asawa or Dario Robleto, with whom she's currently co-authoring a book announced under the beautiful title of The Heartbeat at the Edge of the Solar System, Science, Emotion, and the Golden Record. The title of Jennifer's talk today is The Interstellar Medium. Please help me, join me welcoming.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Good afternoon. Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I'm thrilled and really honored to be a part of this panel. I also want to thank a local Jack Madden, astronomer and RISD MFA, who created this image of the interstellar medium on the screen, which will come up several times during my talk. All right, so as Peter mentioned, he basically invited me to this conference because I published this book almost 10 years ago now about images in transit. In it, I tried to generate out of a few 18th and 19th century examples a whole theory of the vehicular image. What happens if we attempt to take the literal transportation of images into account when we interpret the project of visual communication? How can art historians learn to see the physics of an image, its inertia, its momentum, its weight within its visual program? How can we bring to light the distances and delays that beset every image, the friction of distance, as I called it, and the infrastructural networks upon which its very visibility depends. Now, I have to admit that I wrote this entire book without any reference to or inspiration from Warburg, and I'm not sure whether to be proud or ashamed of that, but it's true. If nothing else, maybe this book is a way of thinking about alternative sources of transit theory. I mostly pulled from Derrida and the concept of différance, from Bourdieu and the notion of strategic delay. There's a lot of Latour in there and actor network theory, especially around the notion of the immutable mobile. Malinowski and Jakobson, Riegel, all kinds of people, but none of them were Warburg. So when Peter says that my book is in a silent dialogue with Georges' book, that is one of the reasons. It's a very silent dialogue. So I drifted from the transit topic after I published this book. I immersed myself in print studies for about a decade, and these days I'm working on a new series of projects at the intersection of art and astronomy. I'm trying to define what a celestial humanities might be. I want to find ways of insisting that the territory of the humanities does not and must not end at the stratosphere. Now, this could hardly seem more different from the primary concerns of the humanities today, and it could hardly seem more distant from my little book on swamps and forests and oceans in the 18th and 19th century. But as I was preparing for this talk, I read back through the introduction to this old book, and I remembered that the stars had been there all along. There they are, right on page 3. I was trying to explain how much distance and delay was separating the people who were transmitting pictures back and forth in the 18th century. And I pointed out that the artists featured in this book lived in a world governed by absolute intractable separations that we now associate only with interstellar distances. Just as distant stars are fundamentally inaccessible to synchronous perception from Earth, so were London and Boston separated in the 18th century. The stars in the Andromeda galaxy, for example, are visible, but because their light has taken more than 2 million years to reach the Earth, we see them only as they existed more than 2 million years ago. For all we know, the entire galaxy has since been obliterated. So obviously, I'm really interested in delay and distance and how delay and distance get woven into art history. How can we sense that distance in the images that traverse it, images that often mask or disavow that distance? Outer space is one place that distance and delay cannot be ignored, it cannot be factored out. And I realize looking back at this page now that even then I was taking space not as a vacuum, but as a model of fundamental opacity that I felt compelled to fold back into the arts of the visible. I'm still working through the way this slow, dark universe might be made to press in upon the whole project of human visibility. In the late summer of 1977, taking advantage of a rare alignment of the giant outer planets, NASA launched 2 identical probes that would give us our first look at the vastness of the outer solar system, the Voyagers. Both probes used the giant planets as gravitational slingshots in order to attain escape velocity from the gravitational pull of the sun. Free from the fate of the inner solar system, the sun will eventually become a red giant and engulf the Earth. The Voyagers will likely outlive the Earth itself. This is why there's a gold-plated copper phonograph record bolted to the side of each spacecraft. Only a few months before the launch date, belatedly recognizing the cosmic profundity of the mission's interstellar destiny, NASA asked the astronomer Carl Sagan to lead a team to design an interstellar message to be placed on board the Voyagers as a goodwill greeting for any alien intelligence that might happen upon them in the unimaginably distant future. Given the scales of time and space involved, along with the era's dawning awareness of the imminent possibility of ecological and nuclear catastrophe, it was clear that this message would also function something like an ark, potentially preserving the last remnant of human existence in the universe. The interstellar message would potentially become the most enduring world monument ever designed. With only about 3 months to conceive and create the record, the small group of scientists, writers, and artists on the team faced a humbling task: account for the vast complexity of Earth's history through a small sample of recordings that could fit on 2 sides of an LP. Given the ridiculous haste of the record's compilation and the extreme capacity constraints, the team did manage to assemble an admirably rich and diverse range of content. The record ultimately included greetings recorded in 59 languages, an audio essay tracing the history of Earth sounds, a sampler of 27 musical recordings from around the world, from Senegalese percussion to Mozart's magic flute to Louis Armstrong's melancholy blues, and perhaps surprisingly, for a record, a selection of 116 images that had been converted into sound. The record was encased in an aluminum cover, which was engraved with some key indicators of scale and orientation. So for example, it uses the fundamental transition of the hydrogen atom, 0.7 billionths of a second, as the unit of time that governs all of the time scales on the rest of the record. The cover also includes schematic instructions for playing the record. All these instructions are it's a little bit problematic that they're on the cover of the record because this is the part of the record that's actually being battered by micrometeorites as it's flying through the interstellar medium, and this is the part of the spacecraft that's going to first become illegible. But if aliens can read this cover, they will also find that NASA has helpfully included a cartridge and stylus for playing the record tucked into the spacecraft nearby. In 2013, Voyager 1 entered interstellar space by passing through the heliopause, which is the boundary of the protective bubble blown by the solar wind. It was the first human-made object ever to do so, and it was followed in 2018 by Voyager 2. The Voyagers are still out there, 15 billion miles away and counting, moving at 38,000 miles an hour. They're now farther away from Earth than any other objects ever made by human beings. Having escaped the solar system, they're now entering what's known as the interstellar medium. The interstellar medium, occupying the space between the stars in the galaxy, is vast, but it is not a vacuum. It's rarefied, but it is a rich and complex field of gas, dust, and cosmic rays, subject to density fluctuations, turbulence, and shock waves. The Voyagers pass through this medium, carrying the images born of media on Earth. They're also acting as the interstellar medium's first direct probes, teaching us about its constitution and behavior. The Voyagers are still transmitting invaluable scientific data back to us, but their onboard batteries will die soon, probably within the next 5 years. They will then go silent, given over to the galaxy. Their only remaining transmissions will be the outbound vibrations held in the grooves of the golden records they carry. They will almost certainly never go near another planet. It'll be 60,000 years before either of them comes within even a light year of another star. Any civilization that finds them will have to have developed its own capacities for interstellar travel. They're predicted to last for billions, perhaps even trillions of years, longer again than the entire age of the universe so far. So I want to pause here and just ask, how many of you have actually ever heard of the golden record? Oh, good, okay. And how many of you had any idea that there were images on it? All right, minor group. Probably some of you are astronomers. This is helpful for me to know because I've really written this talk not assuming any knowledge about the Voyager program or even the whole project of space imaging, since it is not usually the kind of thing that comes up in humanities centers. If you are interested in learning more about the Golden Record, the best general source is still the book published in 1978 by members of the team called Murmurs of Earth. And then I'd also recommend this book by my colleague Alex Redding, who's a musicologist at Harvard. He and his co-author Daniel Cha used the provocation of the music on the record to try to redefine music theory here on Earth. And this is worth pointing out here that the Golden Record, because it's a record, has been overwhelmingly understood as a sound artifact offered to the cosmos and to humans on Earth under the sensory rubric of listening. Its primary interpreters have been musicologists and sound scholars and audiophiles. There's very little discussion out there about the images on the record, and the Golden Record has made no mark that I know of on the discipline of art history. But a large percentage of the Golden Record's running time is given over to the images. The images were crucial to the Golden Record's mission and required an enormous investment of time and labor on the part of the team. It's even possible to argue that everything on the Golden Record, even the sounds, is ultimately an image. Although the images are now seen as secondary to the music, in fact, the initial idea was that the Voyagers would carry images to space. Images, in other words, were Plan A. Images had been the primary format for the interstellar messaging that had been attempted up until that point. Frank Drake, the Cornell astrophysicist, who was perhaps the leading theorist of extraterrestrial communication at the time, and was a member of the team that conceived of the record, was clearly partial to images. As he wrote, "The only thing that works when you've had no previous contact and no ability to send a language course is what works with babies or foreigners, and that is to use pictures." So we'd already decided pictures were the best way to carry information. It allowed you to carry a great deal of information, free of ambiguities and misinterpretations. Of course, that's a laughable concept. But Drake is really thinking very broadly about how you communicate with beings that don't even share your own sensory architecture. So he's thinking about these in perhaps a different way than we normally would. But yes, free of ambiguities and misinterpretations. Even those words were quickly dismantled by the project itself. So the two most important precedents for the Golden Record were the Pioneer plaques and the Arecibo message. The Pioneer plaques were launched in 1972, 1973 on board Pioneer 10 and 11 probes, which were also headed to Jupiter and Saturn. They also were headed out of the solar system, but much more slowly. The Voyagers have since passed them. Carl and Linda Sagan designed these plaques. These were really a key precedent for the Golden Record. They were this engraved metal image bolted to the side of the ship. Those of you who know the history of 70s extraterrestrial communication will know that Congress got very upset that NASA had sent smut to the stars by including the nude figures on the front of the plaque. The Arecibo message was sent in November 1974 as an electromagnetic interstellar communication, a series of binary radio bursts designed and sent by Frank Drake. This too was intended as a pictorial transmission. It was a key precedent for the way that the sound wave on the the Golden Record would be organized to form a pictorial array. So this was sort of sent out as a binary code that upon receipt was supposed to be folded into this scan-like digital image. So if the Voyagers were supposed to have images on them, why are we looking at an LP record? Again, the original idea was to do something like the Pioneer plaque, but just more elaborate, a kind of super plaque. But in the course of conversation, someone had the idea to put music on board too in the form of magnetic tape in a container behind the plaque. There is, of course, an intractable problem with this, namely that magnetic information is not going to last very long in and among the fierce magnetic fields beyond the solar system. But the team was really enamored at the idea of sending music. And then eventually, in conversation with Sagan, Frank Drake hit on the idea of simply sending an LP full of music, which, because it's physically engraved, would be much more durable than magnetic tape. It would be an engraved sound tablet that essentially in its travels through space would be much more durable even than any ancient inscription ever devised on Earth. And it was from there that they then had the idea that maybe images could be converted into sound and included along with the music. So materially, the Golden Record is really the same kind of object as the Pioneer plaque. Both are essentially plaques that include images engraved into a sheet of metal. But whereas the engravings on the Pioneer plaque are iconic and symbolic, images that refer through resemblance and through a very simple symbolic vocabulary, the engravings on the Golden Record are operating indexically, meaning that the oscillating grooves are physically caused by their reference, which in this case are sound pressure waves. In the parts of the record that encode sound, speech, and music, these lines are direct images of sound, but in the pictorial parts of the record, the grooves are traces of sound waves that themselves encode pictures. So these engravings are images of the sound of images. And as we teeter between sound and image here, I just want to point out that while it was not common in 1977 to convert images into sound, turning sound into images had been common since the mid-19th century. In fact, the phrase turning sound into images is a synonym for the very practice of sound recording. By definition, sound recording works by making a fixed trace of a vibration that's otherwise ephemeral. All waveform sound recordings are at some level images already. So the breakthrough then for sound recording was that you would take sound, which was so hard to capture, so hard to study, so hard to understand, and turn it into a fixed visible trace, an image, and then suddenly you can do all kinds of things with it. You can analyze its change over time, you can compare one sound recording to another, and eventually after Edison, you can devise an instrument that's going to retrace that image in order to play the sound back. So again, sound recording is already the practice of turning sound into images. Sound recording is an image vehicle for sound. If you want a sound to endure and be transportable over long distances, you need to encase it in a material image, an image container from which it can later be resuscitated. So another way to think of this is that everything on the Golden Record is actually an image. Some of the images are images of sounds, and some of the images are images of sounds of images. Essentially, it becomes very difficult to separate sounds and images on the Golden Record. See. All right, so imagine having only 4 weeks to collect a set of images that will represent the whole history of the Earth for all time. What would you choose? How would you gather the images? Once you're sufficiently humbled by the crushing immensity of that task, now take away almost every technology that you now have at your disposal for searching for images, learning about images, and moving images from place to place. You have no internet, no email, no digital photographs, no smartphones, no personal computers. There are wire transfer services for newspapers, but those are not accessible to you. There are no fax machines, or at least not handy. Even in 1982, a fax machine still cost $20,000. There's no television, there is television, but you can't control or fix that medium, and it contains no library of images. All you have is a telephone and the places where pictures exist in material form: magazines, books, libraries, and picture libraries. And if you want to access or transfer those images, you have to use feet, trains, and snail mail, and airplanes. So in 1977, for the team that are assembling the image track, pictures are physical objects that don't move any faster than boulders. They do move, but they're slow. And one of the points I want to make about this is that with only 4 weeks to assemble the image track, the image track is inevitably problematic. It's a deeply problematic set of images, especially from a political standpoint. But it was actually physically, literally, a very difficult project to bring together 116 images in 1977. So the question of transporting images, the literal time it takes to do so, was just as much an issue in 1977 as it is as the Golden Record moves out into the interstellar medium. Once you've assembled the pictures you want, some from books, some from magazines, some as transparencies or photographs, they then need to be converted into a standard format. And I just want to give you a quick sense of how these images actually got onto the record. All the images from media sources, from any source, were then re-photographed with analog cameras, of course, as 35mm slides, an obsolete technology that some of us may remember using. Then those slides were projected onto a wall. The projection was then videotaped with a TV camera. The TV camera translated each image into a raster scan pattern, a linear trace that responds to the light levels of the image. And then that frame raster, which is what you get on the left here, was then threaded through a brand new machine called the 321 video analyzer, made by a company called Colorado Video. The analyzer would read the intensity value of the video signal at each point in the image raster and convert that to a sound wave. So if you imagine this image as a sweater, you're going to unravel it, feeding the thread into the analyzer, and then each variation in the light intensity will be translated into sound. It's actually really amazing that this machine existed as it did in 1977. Eventually, everyone is going to want to take images and turn them into sound because that's how you get modems, which is then, of course, how you get the internet. But in 1977, there was just this random guy in Colorado who had just invented this machine. And if he hadn't done so, no images would be on the Golden Record today. Then that final image sound thread was output to magnetic tape on a Honeywell 14-track reel-to-reel tape recorder, and then that was taken and used to cut the LP. So the images have been through a lot, even before they get out into the solar system and the Kuiper Belt. This is how the photographs actually look when they are retrieved from the sound grooves on the record. Something to note about these is that they have these, I think, really beautiful and strange ghostly phantom shadows that are sort of falling off of the contours of the images. The person who actually recoded these from the Golden Record is not sure what causes those. It's not at all clear why these shadows come out. It's possibly because the images are coded into both sides of the stereo channel of the LP, so there may be some kind of cross ghosting, as it's called, between images on the record. But just to say that this is how these images will be seen or will be retrievable, perhaps someday, by some impossible aliens. All right. I won't have a lot of time to discuss the content, but just to give you a brief overview, the content of the image track was very carefully sequenced, and in Murmurs of Earth, John Lomberg writes about all of the rationale that went into that. They began with a series of images that were used to establish scale and orientation. So for example, the Andromeda galaxy was included here in order to indicate the chiral orientation of the rest of the images on the track, which means that how will the aliens know whether they have decoded the pictures forwards or backwards? How do they know which is right and which is left? This is actually a fundamental problem in astrophysics, is chirality. So this image of the Andromeda galaxy, which presumably the aliens might have seen, because of the direction of its spiraling, they would presumably know how to decode this image in order to orient themselves bodily to the right and left of the image. The free-floating image needs to be grafted back onto the body of the receiver, in other words. This is a kind of fundamentally empathetic and haptic process of moving images between separate bodies, and this is something that I actually discussed at length in my book in terms of painting. And then on the right is a pulsar map, which is the location of the sun in relation to 14 known pulsars with their periods and distances from Earth noted in binary. Then there were a series of slides laying out units of time and distance. There's a diagram of the solar system. This is another kind of typical form of transporting images, is namely to include calibration systems within your images, especially calibration of scale. Images of the human body, looking more alien than ever. Other biological organisms and ecosystems on Earth. Human technology, and an indication of the diversity of human culture. Most of the images on the Golden Record came out of picture books and mass market photographic magazines. National Geographic was extremely important as a readily available collection of world images. Another important inspiration and source was the famous or infamous Family of Man exhibition. Almost everything that goes on to the Golden Record is coming from this model of mid-century 1970s geographic, ethnographic documentary photography. This stemmed from a sincere goal of diversity and inclusion, but of course we now recognize the cultural and racial bias coded into ethnographic imaging of this kind. And we could go on about this for weeks, but I'm going to move instead to think a little bit, just for a moment, about what is missing before getting on to an analysis of the whole image project itself. Two things that are missing from the record need to be mentioned. For one, for everything that is on the record, there is no visual art included anywhere in the scheme of images. The images were included as information technology, not as aesthetic technology. All of the aesthetic impulses of humanity were meant to be included in the music, not in the images. One of the excuses for this was that there wasn't enough time to assemble a panel of art historians to be able to credibly create a diverse representation of the visual arts on Earth. So that also means that the entire image track is devoted to diagrams and essentially documentary photographs. So if any aliens intercept the Golden Record and decode the image, they will assume that photography and diagrams are the only way we know how to think visually. The other thing that's missing is death and war and violence. NASA's official stance was best face forward for the Golden Record. We should send the best of ourselves. We should not indicate war, death, poverty, enslavement, or violence. Why preserve that forever? The other reason for this was avoiding divisive content on the record, because this was supposed to represent all of humanity. Anything divisive, such as a war, would not be able to fulfill that goal. Another reason for this that was often brought up was that they wanted to avoid the appearance of aggression. So there was a discussion about should we include the explosion of a nuclear warhead on the golden record. Should we see an image of a mushroom cloud? And one reason that they didn't do that was they didn't want to make it seem as if we were threatening the aliens with our war technology. To my mind, and this is what the book I'm working on now is largely about, is that this is what is really the most problematic part about the golden record, is the fact that it leaves out all of the bad news about humanity. So that's a quick introduction to the golden record and the images on it. Obviously, I could go on, the politics, the aesthetics, the history of this project. It's bottomless. We could bring the whole arsenal of media studies, cultural studies, art history, science studies to bear on these images, and I hope that these images become wider and known within the humanities so that all of this can happen. There's a lot we can ask of these images, but I want to take a slightly different tack for the remainder of this talk and think about what these images ask of us. Why we should, sitting in a humanities center on Earth, care about this precarious collection of images that's 15 billion miles away. These images are the limit case of this symposium, the most transported of transported images. They define the edge of the diameter of human image transmission, at least in material form. They're the surfaces of the human image bubble expanding into a non-human medium. In what ways would including them in our discussion expand or revise our understanding of images, of infrastructure, of media? I want to spend the rest of the talk speculating on these questions. And just to be clear, if it isn't already, I'm not trying to set up the golden record as the exemplary theorization of interstellar image transmission, but it is a theorization, and these are the first interstellar images. As such, they're the first instance and the first practical theorization of the whole endeavor, and they deserve our attention. There are two examples of images within images on the golden record. Images that are self-reflexive about their own status as transported images, and that incidentally also break the iron grip of photography as our image format. So both of these kinds of images are images that aren't photographs. I want to start with this one, number 111, an image of an image in a book. The Golden Record team knew that they couldn't explain human civilization without including a book. But which book? You can just imagine the agony of trying to decide which illustration from which book to select for the Golden Record. Which page do you save for all eternity? Which book do you hurl out of the window of the Library of Alexandria ahead of the fire? On the advice of an astrophysicist on the team, they decided on this page spread. It comes from Isaac Newton's Treatise of the System of the World, a 1728 English translation of a version of the third book of his famous Principia. And this is my photograph of Harvard's copy of this volume at the Houghton Library. This photograph was composed in order to demonstrate the material and semiotic context of the printed image. The team wanted to show the way symbolic and pictorial information interact in codex book form, and crucially to provide scale by including a human hand. The hand was also there to show that the image is on a thin sheet of what we call paper with another sheet behind it. This particular edition was chosen because of its small size, which meant that the letterpress was relatively large in relationship to the page size, which meant that the text would be legible despite the low resolution of the image on the record. It was here on this page that Newton extrapolated from the law of universal gravitation to explain that if you launched a series of cannonballs from progressively greater heights with progressively greater acceleration, they would eventually leave the surface of the Earth altogether and go into orbit. As explained by John Lomborg, who was in charge of assembling the pictures, for the first time in human history, the procedure for launching an object into orbit was correctly explained and diagrammed. In a way, this page was the first step on the path that led to Voyager. And this is a dizzying picture, a meta picture if there ever was one. Lomborg's argument is that this picture about launching helped launch the Voyagers that then literally launched the picture off the surface of the Earth. This is a startlingly literalized version of what we usually mean by the phrase book launch. The printed image in Newton's book traveled around the world, spreading an idea about the plausibility of gravitational escape, changing the course of science, and leading to the actual launch of these satellites in the 20th century. The image then is itself a launching device, a technology that allows information to escape its own gravitational constraints and its narrow local audiences. Images are launchers, not just things that are launched. Images are not just the cargo, they're the rocket. Ultimately, the argument that the Golden Record is making is that this picture launched itself into space. And again, I'm just struck by how there's a kind of literalization of so many of Warburg's notions of psychic or cultural transmission here. Can we devise an interstellar image studies that is able to account for launched images of this kind? Of course, there's already a long history of interstellar imaging. I've been exploring it in my own way over the past few years by going into the rare book library in my spare time and photographing printed pages of stars in celestial atlases. Like many other historians of art and science, I've been studying the way stars have come to settle into the material world of images on Earth, how they have settled into Earth's image vehicles, embossed into paper, tucked between the pages of books. And this is all very well, but what do we do with images that are now literally tucked between the stars? It seems to me that we need to figure this out. Outer space is no longer just an imaginative or metaphorical realm to be represented in images. It is now literally the medium into which images are moving. Again, this is real. Newton's diagram is really out there, out beyond the solar system, forming the edge of the territory of image transit, the nose cone of the interface between the philosophical and the factual. Newton's launch image in the Principia gave us the idea of universal gravitation. The force that governs the fall of an apple from a tree on Earth is the same force that governs the movement of all of the celestial bodies beyond the Earth. This book, this image, made it possible to understand the Earth and the heavens as part of the same material system. The heavens are not a separate realm made of alternative forms of matter or spiritual substance. The heavens are not ultimately alien to us in that way. We're immersed in the heavens, part of the heavens, living under the same physical laws as the stars and planets do. The laws of gravity apply both on and off planet. Every astrophysicist understands this and takes it for granted, but what about us? What about humanists? Can we make a similar move? Do the laws of the humanities work in the heavens? If they do, will we need to change the way we define and describe them? How do we adapt our thinking for scales of space and time that seem unthinkable for readers and receivers that are totally unknown and unknowable? In other words, what's the escape velocity of the humanities? Can this tiny glint of copper and gold, frittered by micrometeorites, deflected by bow shocks from ancient stellar explosions, carving a lonely path through plasma and dust and molecular clouds for millions and tens of millions and hundreds and thousands of millions and billions of years, can the interstellar images it carries be analyzed under the same laws as images here on Earth? I'd like to suggest that they can, but that it will require that we bring a little bit of the interstellar medium into media studies. There are two other conspicuously meta-pictorial pictures on the Golden Record. Both are interiors showing figures with paintings and prints hanging on the walls. This image of a house interior was actually selected not for the guy painting in the background, but because it shows a fire. They realized that it was necessary to show somewhere on the record that we have combustion on our planet thanks to the oxygen in our atmosphere. So the man painting in the background was incidental, but they did describe that it was nice that we would be able to show something about our creative drives, at least in landscape painting, as Lomberg put it. But of course, note all of the framed paintings in the background. And then there's this image, a 4-generational family portrait from Life magazine that also includes a 5th generation in the background in the form of portraits. Now, there are, of course, an infinite number of ways in which the images on the Golden Record might be nonsensical to an alien. Not just the content of the images either. The very idea of pictures might well seem exceedingly strange. Let's say aliens manage to find the Golden Record, intercept it, somehow figure out how to make a record player, figure out how to configure the images on the track. Why, they might well ask, did we interrupt a perfectly good continuous sound groove with these strange formatted sections, these sounds that are supposed to be folded up into wafer-like surface objects extracted from the flow of duration and perceived as planar chunks? And then, what's this obsession with rectangles? Why is this information so insistently fixed in these frames? Why all these boxes, these containers, rectangles and rectangles, frames and frames, boxes and boxes? Why indeed? It's partly because we're dorsoventral creatures. We have fronts and backs, and all of our optical apparatus is in the front of us. In other words, we don't have eyes in the backs of our heads. If we want to see something, it has to be in front of us, so it makes sense for us when we want something to be seen to make it into an object that we can place in front of our eyes. Maybe this was the first impetus for the vehicular image in human culture, the need to move the visible around to the front. But maybe aliens, if in fact they even have eyes, which is another question, do have eyes in the back of their heads. Maybe they're radially symmetrical and don't think about vision directionally the way we do. Maybe they respond to light in the same way we respond to sound. Maybe aliens have a kind of light ear, seeing in an immersive way, so that a picture as a bounded object would make about as much sense to them as a bound sound object makes to us. They might also notice that along with our interest in framing things in rectangles, we're very concerned about contours inside the images as well. We seem intent upon separating inviolate objects from each other. Many of the pictures on the Golden Record are accompanied by silhouette versions that clarify the shapes and boundaries of individual entities in the photographs. Lomberg writes a lot about this. In a low-res photograph, or any photograph, how do you convey to an alien who may not understand perspective that a bird flying behind a person's head isn't in fact an appendage growing out of that person's head? How do you keep objects from becoming entangled with each other in images? And then his solution was to create these silhouettes to accompany the most tangly images. But maybe aliens don't think about the universe as made up of solid objects separated by empty space. In fact, they probably don't, because if these aliens are interstellar travelers, they've inevitably come to realize that so-called space is full of fields and particles and waves that connect bodies to each other. Space is a medium, not a vacuum. It's filled with forces and radiation and particles that interpenetrate and can join objects. Just one example, this is a visualization of two objects in space, Jupiter and its moon Io, along with the intense tidal forces, fields of plasma and magnetism that link the two. There is no empty or neutral space between them. Maybe to the aliens, our pictures indicate the provincial state of our culture because we still believe in autonomous objects. We still seem to believe that there is such a thing as empty space. I'm showing you this Jupiter and Io image out of all the possible spacey force field images I could show, because the Io plasma torus and the Io flux tube and the shape of Jupiter's magnetic field were, ironically, first detected and measured by the Voyagers themselves as they literally moved through them. In fact, they would not have been able to detect these fields if they had not literally moved through them, and they're using as you can see, the arrow is pointing to the Golden Record on the Voyager. The Voyager is surrounded by this bristling array of sensitive instruments, many of which were known as direct sensing instruments, which is to say that they measured the space around them by being in direct tactile proximity to it. So the movement was synonymous with the detection. As the Voyagers passed Jupiter, carrying these pictures of isolated objects on the Golden Record, the instruments mounted just a few inches away were getting a very different kind of spatial picture. In other words, the images they were carrying contradicted the images that they were gathering. The medium of the documentary picture, with its logic of objects in compliant perspective, contradicted the medium of interplanetary space with its logic of immersive entanglement. There are a lot of ways to think about this lack of correspondence between an image and the space through which it moves. But to conclude, I just want to focus on what this detachment means for the way we visualize outer space today. The logic of detachment is baked into the very idea of the portable rectangular picture. Easel painting was developed in the early Renaissance as a way of detaching images from fixed social and spatial contexts. The advent of the canvas support, which was itself derived from transport via the Venetian sail industry. The canvas support allowed for a light surface, easy to move and independent of any particular architectural surround. And the strategies that led to the development of the object now called a picture, the bounding frame, the internal relation of forms and narratives, and especially the deployment of linear perspective, liberated the internal space of representation in a picture from the external space through which it moved. So in other words, the space of illusionistic reference was sealed off from the space of physical referral. The resulting geographic autonomy of the picture format would come to exemplify the aesthetic autonomy that defined modern art history from Kant to Greenberg. Now, we're still actually very much enthralled to this uprooted, rectangular, detached model of the image and its intentional blindness to its own transmission context. Think about contemporary space imaging, say the spectacular new images being generated from the James Webb Space Telescope's observations. These images come to us in rectangular format, organized in the same way pictures of more mundane objects do. They present celestial phenomena as objects in a frame. They emphasize clarity and sharpness. This nebula leaps forward in such astonishingly high resolution that the very word nebula, a term denoting vagueness from the Latin for cloud or mist, no longer seems to apply. And they produce an intense illusion of accessibility and proximity. These objects are offered up on our device screens in the same format as our Amazon shopping carts. This is one of my favorite things to do on the Chandra X-ray Observatory's web pages, shop for supernova remnants. But we have to ask, for everything that they show us, what is missing from these images? What's missing from these pictures? Essentially, what's missing is the interstellar medium. There's no sign of what lies between us and these structures, no sign of their transportation as images. We can see a lot here, but we cannot see the 6,500 years that it took the light from this object to reach us. We're given the illusion of synchronous access, but this ruin is a structure, a fossil. The pillars of creation here in this famous Hubble Space Telescope image. We see it only as it existed 6,500 years ago. This gap, this delay, is an absolute epistemological obstruction. We can never see the Eagle Nebula as it is right now. There is a solid wall of time between us and this object, an impassable distance. And yet it appears to us as if it were sitting in the same empty space you'd find in any Earth photograph. One way I like to convey and think about the fundamental absolute opacity of space-time is to say that, we have a telescope now that can see 13 billion years into the past, but there is no telescope that can show us even the surface of the sun as it exists right at this moment. The scale of outer space makes the asynchrony of images impossible to ignore. So we have an image format that's designed to eliminate its own vehicular physics, to make invisible the distance through which it has traveled and the impact of that distance upon it. This image format is now governing our images of the universe. How might we envision the universe differently so that its opacity, distance, and delay, all its turbulence, become part of our understanding of it? Maybe the obvious question now here at the end is, why should we care about any of this? With all the problems we have here on Earth, why should we care whether our images of space reveal the friction of their own transmission? Why should we worry about exactly how we see these impossibly distant things? Why not use our portable pictures model as we always have? Doesn't matter, it's outer space, it doesn't concern us. But the thing is, it does concern us, and it is about to concern us a great deal more. Just as the Voyagers are literally carrying visual culture beyond the solar system, humans are on the brink of occupying off-world space. NASA's Artemis program is about to restart manned moon landings. The corporate space industry is about to start mining everything it can get its hands on in the solar system: moons, asteroids, planets. It is possible that microbial life, or fossils thereof, will be returned to Earth from Mars in the next decade. Probes are being launched that may well detect microbial life in the subsurface oceans of Europa and Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn. How will we treat that life? How are we going to occupy that space? The historian Elizabeth Kessler, whose book Picturing the Cosmos is the only substantial interdisciplinary study of recent space imaging, has demonstrated that Hubble Space Telescope images draw heavily on the transported images of the 19th century American West. She reminds us that astronomical images carry forward, often unintentionally, the memory of earlier views across the frontier. As such, these images bear enormous responsibility, and this is why I think humanists do need to care about space. We're about to repeat the colonial and genocidal patterns of earlier expansions. We can't leave this project to Elon Musk and the Space Force. If we imagine space, the solar system, the interstellar medium, etc., as a series of objects delivered to us in these pictorial containers, as things that are proximate, available, detached, and deracinated, as empty, rather than full of slow, thick, immersive space, we will make different decisions about it than we will if we truly recognize the melancholic vastness, darkness, and opacity of the universe. We will treat this space differently if we recognize ourselves as immersed in it, traveling through its turbulence, in and of the cosmos, not merely looking at its pictures. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. May I invite George to join us? Maybe we can sit here and we can take like 15 minutes to answer some questions for our guests. Any questions for George? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your amazing talk. So you're talking about sound of images. What do they sound like?
That's a great question. You can actually listen to them. So if you go, I'm gonna tell you to Google Ron Barry golden record. And there's just this guy named Ron Barry about 6 years ago in his spare time decided to try to decode the images off of the record. All of the images that I showed with the shadows were generated by him. But he also made a YouTube video that shows you the way the images actually come up image by image on the record, 8 seconds per, just the way they kind of scan in, but it's also accompanied by the sound wave and all the sound of the images. So there's this really sharp kind of sound announcement of each image track. It's like a high level beep, and then it's a sort of static sound for each image. But you can, the images are there as sounds, so you can listen to that. Yeah, I would highly recommend taking a look at that.
There's another question there. Maybe if you can go to the microphone. Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one or two. Jennifer, it seems like your talk was rife with metaphorical thinking, which brings up interesting questions for the humanities and for logic in particular. The metaphor in particular that seems operative here has to do with going back to the Newton illustration with ballistics, right? Shoot something out of the earth and eventually it goes out into space and keeps going. It was the premise for Jules Verne's Earth to the Moon, right? Which is a bunch of laid off artillery officers from the Civil War coming up with a scheme to shoot a projectile at the moon.
Launched from Tampa, I believe, actually.
Yeah, someplace in Florida, which was no man's land at that point in the 19th century for a Frenchman. But that metaphor then of the Voyager as a projectile carrying a payload outwards is a very outward-facing kind of metaphor in a way, right? It's like the thing gets away from us. Although the corollary to that is the moonrise picture where we look back at ourselves. And it seems like your talk is primarily about using this as a way of looking back at ourselves rather than the kind of ludicrous proposition that is outlined by the record. But it seems like the sibling of this metaphor is radio telemetry, the SETI project sending radio signals out instead of actual physical objects on the projectile metaphor. And in that case, all of the possibilities and dangers, the danger, by the way, if anybody saw the Star Trek movie, is that they might actually find Voyager and in fact, misunderstand it. They called it Viger, and it basically became a roadmap to how to find Earth and to destroy it.
Right.
The same thing could be said about the metaphor of the radio telescope and SETI sending messages out. Basically, now you've become a lighthouse sending emissions outwards, which can be traced back to their source, which is the idea. So even though the astronomers are, again, outward facing in their messaging, it comes back to us in a way, in a kind of reflection. So I wonder what happens when you put the metaphors together, the way they actually were born together at the same time.
Wow, okay, thanks. I'm trying to make my way through that question. There were multiple questions in there and lots of things I'd love to say. I don't think of this, of the golden record as being unidirectional, as being about ballistics as opposed to the sort of return view from the Earth. I mean, it is simply by virtue of being an object that has been sent into this unknowable or unknown space. It is an object that forces us to think in reverse about how we would appear to something or someone on the other side of the universe. So I think that these two do go together. The radio telescope question in particular is interesting. Of course, Frank Drake was central to SETI, to the notion of the radio telescope, to sending out a message that might be received and returned. But there's actually a lot of really interesting writing about why it's actually more efficient to send material objects as communications than radio transmissions, because radio transmissions will disperse through the interstellar medium. There's a great paper by Christopher Rose called Inscribed Matter as the Most Efficient Mode of Extraterrestrial Communication. So those of us who are interested in prints and inscriptions and incisions might want to read that. But the question of the return passage is so often represented in fiction as being a question of fear, a question of detection, a fear of being attacked by aliens who might find us out in the world. And my view of that is actually that those kinds of fears are partially the result of our failure to see and picture and understand the actual size of the cosmos. Yeah, there may be microbial life scattered around the universe, but actually the chance that there is anywhere in any kind of proximity to us, any sort of intelligent civilization that's had time to develop is extremely slim. The universe is a lonely space where I think we should be thinking about announcing ourselves just as a way of leaving beacons out for potential future discovery by some other civilization. We'll be gone by the time anyone finds this. So the fear that we have of aliens finding this and coming back and attacking us is, I think, partially based on the illusion of proximity that our images give us of the universe. So this is a project about trying to see the actual vastness and distance in the universe. I mean, if every star in the galaxy were a grain of sand, they would be 89 miles apart. That's how much space there is out there. So I don't think aliens are ready to attack. I think we'll be lucky if they find sort of the corner of a broken up piece of our culture in the future.
Thank you. I know that George has a question for you. I just wanted to make a very brief comment about your two talks. I think of them as two thought experiments about what exactly an image is. And it really struck me that on the one hand, George, by the way, you showed us yesterday in your seminar some beautiful images that were the same pages from Galileo's book.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's incredible.
Really?
But in a way, you presented us with a thought experiment, and thought experiments always involve variations, right, around a nucleus, and the nucleus being here, what is an image, the very concept of the image. And your thought experiments were like variations in terms of earthly migrations, right? And Jennifer, basically, as many people who have wandered throughout the history of literature, philosophy, I'm thinking about these speculations like Fontenelle or others who take outer space as a pretext for speculating about what exactly an image is, why a rectangle, why a frame, why in front, etc. So I'm struck by this kind of distant, again, maybe silent dialogue between your talks. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. I know that, Tim, you wanted to ask one, and George too. So maybe, Tim, you were first, and then...
I'm not sure if it's a large question or a small question, but I was prompted to think about the question by Jennifer's sort of rhetorical question at the end, why should we care? And then also what is missing. And of course, what is missing from the golden record is, you know, the image of interstellar space itself. And it's made me start thinking about Bergson and Bergson's concept of the primacy of images. And in a way, it takes off from your comment, Peter, about what an image is. And that's what's most provocative about both of these papers. What is an image? Migration is an image. I mean, is there a way in which one might think about the image of the image? I mean, the migration itself is an image. What calls for us to think about migration itself as the image or the metaphor, as Doug was saying, that is governing our understanding here? So I just found myself wanting to revert to the Bergsonian insistence upon the primacy of images, the image as the image of ourselves looking, the image of ourselves even as asking the question, and where is that primacy, that attention to the primacy of the image? Aren't we already juggling with images as soon as we depend upon a concept such as migration, or even the concept of this absurd, ingenious and moronic project of the golden record?
Do you want to answer?
As you wish. I mean,
I thought it was for you.
Oh, I think it was for both of us, but okay, I guess I'm going to answer it. That's a really great question, and I don't have a beautiful, perfect answer ready for you, but something that, I mean, I've been forced in trying to imagine how to put space images next to Renaissance paintings and have them to seem to be part of the same system. I've also been forced to really wrestle with what I think an image is and what about this primacy of images, as you say. And one of the things that has come through for me in my teaching is the realization that, you know, images are portals to the non-visible. Like any image is, it's not just a representation, it's a portal, it's a passage, it's an opening to that which we can't see. Certainly any kind of mythological painting is this way. It shows something that is non-visible, brings it to us, transports it to us. And that notion of the portal, I think, is a helpful way of imagining any kind of image as primacy, because the fact is that, you know, the other thing about thinking about interspecies communication is that you're forced to think about your own body and how it sees and perceives and how images come to it. And we're creatures that are just trapped in these bags of flesh. We can't see even 1 nanosecond into the future or into the past. We can't see beyond the immediate boundaries of our eyes. We have a very limited range of perceptibility in the electromagnetic spectrum. So we are intensely limited beings, and our images allow us to look beyond this tiny point in space that we have, space and time. And that is why, anything beyond that material reality, whether it's psychic or spatial or physical, has to be governed by an image. And what I'm concerned about is, do we, as we work with images, do we naturalize them to the point that we imagine ourselves to actually be to be greater than we are, to be able to reach more fully than we actually can, or do we try to find a way to fold humility, a kind of species humility, into the way we think about images? We do need to reach out beyond ourselves, but we also have to recognize that we work to do that, and that there's a friction in that, and a politics of that, and the physics of it too. I hope that partially answered your question. Thanks.
And George, you had a comment or question?
I didn't understand the question.
But you had a question for Jennifer,
Yes,
maybe,
I have
yes,
question.
or a comment.
I want to know what you did with the fire.
I had just one naive question,
Yeah.
and one association of ideas or words. The naive question is why the images are so blurred. I didn't understand that, but my English is not so good, so perhaps you explain.
Yeah.
And the association of ideas is America, Amerigo, propaganda, gold.
Yeah.
So this is a golden object.
Yes. Gold-plated.
Yes.
Yeah. It's copper.
On which it is written images of Earth, United States of America. It's amazing. America means for me Americo Vespucci. Amerigo for me means the institution, the creation in Roma of this great institution whose name was Propaganda Fide, the propagation of the faith, which was an essential institution for the propagation of Catholicism in the Americas, especially in South. Therefore, this propagation of faith comes along with a captation, a colonial captation of wealth. So it's a capitalist fact, in which a crucial moment for me was the book by Edward Bernays named Propaganda, which was the favorite book of Joseph Goebbels, by the way. Propaganda by Bernays is the basis of the American institution of advertisement, as you know. So, what my association is about, when you are, when you want to colonize, on dit ça, colonize, when you want to, it's correct? When you want to colonize a place, what is the first contact? You know this film, First Contact, which is an amazing film. It's with between Australian people, and you know this film? No, it's extraordinary. So when there is the first contact, you give a gift, and you take the gold. In book first of Capital, Karl Marx was speaking about fetishism, you know. And he was already criticizing the capitalist religion as a religion when he noted I just took my passage. He noted something what he had read in the writings of Charles de Brosse, that, I quote, the savages of Cuba had very pertinently seen in the Spanish conquistadors an army of fanatics whose religion, whose fetish was none other than gold. Is it relevant for you for this subject or not?
I mean, of course it's relevant. Of course, the Golden Record, was launched by the American space program, and you can potentially see all of this propaganda and colonialism in it. But there are also counter readings of the project. First of all, one thing I'll say is that yes, gold is gold in human economies, but the reason that the Golden Record is golden is that gold is an inert metal that will not be corroded by the interstellar medium. So there's a lot of gold on spacecraft, and it's not for economic reasons. It's for literal reasons of transportation. Like if you literally want to get through the interstellar medium, you have to have gold on your spacecraft. So this is just one of the many ways that I'm so interested in the way the literal and the lyrical, or the literal and the cultural, collide with each other in each of these projects. We're forced to think about gold in a totally different way. Not to say that it doesn't carry these cultural connotations as well, but that I think we also need to look back at the humanities from the sciences and be able to talk about these physical, chemical reasons that different materials exist and work the way they do. The other thing I'd say is that I don't think of the Golden Record as a successful colonizing gesture. The Golden Record is going to be lost. It's a profoundly humble object. It's ridiculous in that sense, but someone once said that it's a narcissistic vision of American culture, but it is a kind of cosmic mirror, but it's a narcissistic mirror that's going to be 15 billion light years away eventually. I mean, it's not a very useful narcissistic mirror if it's on the other side of the universe and you can't actually see yourself there. And I would also just say that if you read back through one of the things that I'm most interested in the history of the Golden Record is the history of contestation around these colonial ideologies that NASA and the government were trying to impose upon it. The book I'm writing is basically about a surreptitious feminist recording that's on the Golden Record. And yeah. And Carl Sagan didn't agree with everything that NASA was asking him to do. Again, this is a highly problematic object, but it's absolutely a rich and complex one. And I think it doesn't simply reinscribe the colonial dynamics of the 16th century and onward. I think it needs a much more careful investigation. I do think that the lesson of the Golden Record for me is that outer space is part of our system, but it's not the same, and we can't treat it the same way that we treat colonial space on Earth. I'll leave it there. Oh, and they're blurry because they had to be converted into this low-resolution television image structure in order to be turned into a sound wave. Yeah.
I just want to add a small statement, not about images, migrating images, but migration in general, which is in no way a magic word. Migration is not good or bad. There is a use value, of course, and it's extremely, it's terrible that there is an oppressed migration and an oppressor migration, which can be seen simply in the meeting in the same Greek island of dead migrants and mass tourism. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for these two beautiful talks and for this nascent dialogue and also tense conversation with many points of discussion. Thank you so much, really. And so we'll take